you're a step ahead of me. Excellent. Well, welcome back, everybody. I was waiting for Kirsty, but she's a step ahead of me. She's already sitting under the chair to deliver her report. So the first item after our break is the housing strategy for Waipa. Take away, Kirsty. Thank you.
I'm through you, Madam Chair, tēnā koutou katoa. I'd like to ask that this report be taken as read. As you're well aware, the housing group and councillors have been discussing council's role with respect to the provision of housing. So, and we've had some feedback from the housing working group and councillors with respect to where we operate currently and where we would like to operate moving into the future, recognising that role as regulatory enabler, the desire to partner with other agencies to deliver housing, and the role of the community advisors in terms of working with individual families within our community. There was also feedback from elected members regarding the involvement of the community with respect to priorities and actions in this space. So today, the recommendation is to have you or seek your endorsement of the Waikato Regional Housing Initiative strategy and the Waipa plan on a page. We're also seeking a recommendation to make a recommendation to the new council, endorsing these, and then from there staff would develop priorities and actions to bring back to the new council. The intention is that we would then look at what community engagement is required to seek community input into those. I'm happy to respond to any questions.
Thanks, Kirsty. Very succinct report as always. Questions for Kirsty or comments in respect of her report? Roger. No comments on the report, Kirsty, but just from my personal viewpoint to endorse the thinking that's around this. I think it's really, really good and it's worthwhile that we move down in that track to have that kind of approach. So well done. Thank you. Lou and then Claire.
Yeah, I'd like to, through you, Madam Chair, to reiterate what Councillor Gordon has just said. Thank you very much. Well done. And I totally agree with the strategy. I think it's the right direction we should be taking.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I echo all the others as well, because I'm really rapt to see it. I'm excited that it'll be going through for recommendation to the new council, and I do think we should be even doing more work on it actually. Yeah, so looking forward to that happening as well, and appreciate all that you've been putting into it. Thank you.
Yeah,
I'd like to move adoption when it comes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Roger.
Through you, Madam Chair, when we last spoke, there was discussion about the role of key stakeholders. So just for your awareness, we have given the heads up that this matter was being presented to the committee today to those key stakeholders. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsty. I'm not sure if any of you got dropped along the other day to Kāinga Araha had a drop-by session about the homes that they're looking at building through Kāinga Ora. And I had a quick chat with the gentleman from Kāinga Ora who was there, and he was delighted to hear that we were going to be endorsing the Waikato Regional Housing Initiative strategy. So it's certainly a strong alignment with the regional thinking there. So Roger's happy to move that. Lou, you will second it for me. I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thanks, Kirsty. Moving on then to our next item, which is a report on update on future-proof work program currently underway. Morning, David. Nice to see you.
Good to see you, Madam Chair and committee members. Morena. I'd like to do what Kirsty's just done and ask that we take this report as read. This is just an information report. I'll give you a quick summary, basically, of the points in the report. And what it is it's a chance to give you a brief update on a couple of work streams underway being run through Future-Proof. Now, you have reports on a fairly regular basis about the Three Waters program and also about the transport business case, the rapid transit business case. But there are a couple that go through a technical group that I'm a member of that you won't have had updates. And so the work streams that this planning and policy work group are responsible for, there's a couple. And the first is something that was a spin-off from the Hamilton Waikato Metro Spatial Plan project. And you'll remember at that stage, we had central government becoming a partner to Future-Proof, and they drove an initiative which they're doing across all the major high growth areas in the country. And what it is they want the responsible authorities to identify what they call priority development areas, areas that are seen to deliver change at pace and scale in terms of delivering housing. You'll remember the government came under a lot of pressure and is still under a lot of pressure in terms of delivering affordable housing. And it's not something we've seen a lot of success on. And so this initiative, Priority Development Areas, was a kind of government-driven initiative that we've picked up. And so we've got a work stream that's looked at identifying priority development areas across the sub-region, and we've got quite a long list of priority development areas, and there's a good few in Waipa. But it was then felt that this was too much of a mouthful from a central government viewpoint with they considering such areas across the entire country. So a short list has been compiled of 5 areas, and no surprise, they're mostly around Hamilton, where you've got some big stuff happening. And they, the only exception is one at Huntly. And you'll remember the Slumberland development proposal at Ahiniwai, and that's a kind of major driver for a priority development area that picks up Huntly. And that one's got it's probably one of 2 that has a big social housing component to it. And the other aspect with these priority development areas, they're seen as areas that no one partner can deliver on their own. So in these instances, there are government agencies and territorial authorities, as well as a number of other agencies involved. So it could be things like from Ministry of Housing, Ministry of Transport, Kāinga Ora, Kiwi Rail, blah, blah, blah. So they tend to be multi-agency initiatives. So that bit of work, I've mentioned there's one at Huntly, there's one at Rotakuri, Greenfield Development, there's one at Ruakura, which picks up the industrial and the housing development there. And then there's one focused on the central city, which is all about putting people into the CBD area, really talking about apartment living at scale. And then there's the other social one related, well, it has a similar portfolio to the Huntly one, is Enderley Fairfield, which is picking up the existing social housing there, but expanding that and redeveloping it. So those are the 5 that are being looked at there. And what I propose doing is I'll give you report backs, and this will be the last chance with this triennium. So it'll be the new council that will give you further updates on how that progresses. The other 2 work streams are development monitoring. You'll remember I used to give you fairly regular updates on development capacity monitoring being run through Future-Proof. And that work kind of tailed away a bit and has been resurrected and picked up because it is a requirement under the National Policy Statement for Urban Development. And in fact, they've added requirements since bringing in the medium density residential standards. So there's more work to be done there. And what I can tell you is we probably should get to you a first report for the sub-region, but it'll also pick up Waipa, the details for Tiamutu and Cambridge, before the end of the year. So that's something to look forward to. And then the third work stream is something called a future development strategy, which is also a requirement of the government, of the National Policy Statement for Urban Development. And you'll remember when I last gave you an update, our hope had been that Future-Proof would be the equivalent to that future development strategy. And with bringing out the medium density residential standard at the end of last year, it's had new requirements added to it. So simply Future-Proof doesn't cut the mustard. It's not adequate to the task. And we have to do a thing called the Future Development Strategy. We're trying to tailor it to the things that Future-Proof hasn't covered and just pick up the new stuff. And it's at a stage where we're still working out the terms of reference for that piece of work. It will get underway before the end of the year, and it needs to, the other requirement under the NPSUD, the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, is that it has to feed into your next long-term plan cycle. So this is one of the new requirements, and yeah, timing is going to be the difficult component. I mean, we're already looking at, the program of work for the next long-term plan. So just something to bear in mind. And yeah, that's enough from me. Any questions?
Fantastic, David. Roger.
Yes, David, thank you. Thank you for that confusion. But I think, we're getting, there's this hierarchy of planning documentation just seems to be becoming so much of a confused landscape, if you like, because my previous discussions with you, I've asked the question, is Future-Proof a regional policy statement? And the understanding that I've got is that, well, it's not yet, but at some stage it has to be part of a regional policy statement. When's that going to happen?
Good question, Councillor. So one of the bits of work, there are a couple of other bits of work that have been run through Tony Quickford, who's given you updates on, the Plan Change 26 to introduce their medium density residential standard. That's been mirrored by work being done by Hamilton City, their Plan Change 12, and Variation 3 being done by Waikato District Council. So they're doing similar bits of work. Now, that's the one side of that. There's another component that has to be picked up by the regional council and translate through to the regional policy statement to pick that up. And what the regional council are busy grappling with is they need to do that to meet the requirements of the RMA amendment, the MDRS requirements, but they also need to pull in the updated Future-Proof strategy position. So what they're doing is they've got a proposed change to the regional policy statement to do both together. You'll remember under the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and the amendment to the RMA, we were required to notify our plan changes to bring in the medium density standards on the 20th, by the 20th of August. The Regional Council and in fact the Waikato District Council have already written to the Minister to say they cannot meet those timeframes and have asked the Ministry to take that into account. The Ministry has replied to the Waikato District Council to say, we hear you, we accept you've got good reasons, you're liaising with officials, that's fine. The Regional Council, I think they've
been given a 2-year.
Well, no, they haven't. The undertaking by the District Council is that they will still meet the timeframes in terms of running the process of hearings with Hamilton and us, Waipa, in the earlier part of next year. So they've still got to meet the overall timeframes. That's the undertaking they've made. But with the Regional Council, what they've said to the Ministry is their plan change, what they call plan change 1 to the regional policy. Sorry, it's not a plan change, it's just called change. It's all RMA terminology, sorry, Councillor Gordon. Their change 1 to the regional policy statement to bring in both the Future-Proof update and the new MPS requirements will be, I think they're anticipating notifying that later this year. We've had an early draft come to us for comment, and I will, once it's reached the point of being notified, well, in fact, you will have, there's a timing issue. So this council won't be able to, it'll be the new council that gets a report on that plan change.
But does that still mean that any greenfield development that's going to happen. There's going to be quite a bit of that in Cambridge as we see the balance of those growth cells being taken up. Will they need to meet, if they went out, say, tomorrow with a plan, the new medium density requirements as in future proof?
It's not, the future proof's not our statutory document, it's our district plan and it's the regional policy statement. As I've said, the regional policy statement has to still be updated. So don't worry about the
that won't come in.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay. But what we will have to take into account is we have notified our plan change 26. So that's what we're guided by.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Any other questions from anyone? David?
Quick questions for you, Madam Chair. In terms of, we've just gone through all of the hearings for future proof and agreed the areas for expansion, and we've just had this morning a request for extending an industrial area in Cambridge. So what's the process now in terms of working with future proof? Because it's, as you've said, it's not our statutory document, but it is an agreement between the three territorial authorities. That's the area that we've planned for residential, industrial, whatever. So what's the process now to get back and say, despite the fact we've only just approved the locations of these areas, we've got some amendments that we want to put forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, Your Worship. There's two things in terms of answering that. The one is Futureproof has created what it calls a kind of process protocol for dealing with what are considered out of sequence or unplanned development proposal. I think there's an acceptance and it's provided for in the National Policy Statement for Urban Development. It's basically an acceptance that you can't just ring fence the future, that there has to be a process for entertaining proposals that are not according to your planning. So there is a protocol for assessing those that is set out in Futureproof, and that's part of the bit that's being put into the regional policy statement. So then it has statutory weight. The other aspect is there's a realization there were a couple of proposals, development proposals that came in that missed the kind of future-proof gate. And it's proposed that when we do the future-proof strategy, that it picks up those ones and takes them into account. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Any other questions, observations? No? Wonderful. So we have a recommendation there to receive your report on page 1829. Just making the point. You're happy to move that for me, Claire? Roger will second that. Put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against?
Thank you.
Thank you once again, David. So clear as mud. So that brings our meeting to a conclusion, and we have a couple of wee workshops to follow, but I believe we have to put a resolution to move into public excluded for the first of those. Is that right? Or is it the other way around? Oh, look at me. Brilliant, look at that. So how about we just launch straight into our first workshop, which is an introduction to the annual plan. Kirsty, Cheryl and Yolanda. Gary. Yeah. Kirsty's over there. Welcome, ladies. The floor is yours.
Kia ora koutou. If I can just begin by first introducing Cheryl Egerton, who is a strategic planning consultant assisting the strategy team whilst we have vacancies, particularly providing assistance with our long-term plan and annual plan projects. Some of you may have met Cheryl previously. She did assist Waipa back in about 15, 16. Yeah, and is passionate about our Waipa communities. So today this presentation will be led by Yolanda and myself, and it really is a touch point prior to the election, just to set the scene in terms of how things are looking for the 23-24 financial year, as against year 3 of the long-term plan. So we'll just see if this is going to play ball for us today. So the purpose of the workshop is to highlight the impacts on the annual plan and 24-34 long-term plan, to provide a bit of a recap as to the process, and then what you can expect towards the end of the calendar year when you return post-election, and what your role will be in the processes to follow.
Chair, so we firstly just want to set the scene in terms of what we said in year 3 of the LTP and some of the changes that we've been seeing in recent times. So we had growth at 3% with an average increase in rate of 3.7 after growth. And we were working with inflation rates of 2.4 to 3.2 over the period, and we're already seeing CPI at 7.3, which is then interest rates, we were working on 1.12% for new debt that we'd be taking up in year 3. Currently OCR is at 3, so that also has an impact. In our capital expenditure, that was the budget that we had in year 3. We have seen roll carryovers from 22-23 and then 23-24. So we will have to rework our capital budget as well. And then our debt levels were projected at 308 million in year 3. Currently, at the end of June 2022, we were sitting on debt levels of 149, so significantly below that level. Growth for the 21-22 financial year that we are undergoing an audit soon for, we ended up at 3.18% versus a budget of 2.93%.
Could I just, the OCR is at 3. Do we have a figure or a projection for our borrowing through LGF, FA?
So we use Bancorp. So every time we do inquire about loans over a period, they do advise us. We haven't had an update from them. Another matter that we're seeing in the field is issues on procurement. So we still have issues around supply chain availability. Prices are increasing, and that's occurring regularly. Some of those on a weekly basis, so contractors need to factor that into their pricing, and work may actually occur significantly later than tender closing date. There is an issue around staff availability for our contractors and retention, which create a risk for contractors to deliver on agreed timeframe. The impact of that for us is that council see these risks translate into additional costs, along with the level of growth work available for contractors. We have our own issues around staffing resourcing and relying on consultants to help us deliver the work program. And our budgets have been based on prices that were pulled together before the current inflation and supply chain issues were impacting. So our key assumptions that's being tested is resource cost. We're expecting these to increase due to inflationary impacts as well as the labour market constraints. Growth, there's uncertainty around this. We're not sure how that's going to play out. Development contributions, it's lower than we projected in year 1 of the LTP, mainly due to the timing of development. We had issued 302 notices in the 21-22 financial year. Of these, 129 had been paid at year end. Then another issue is the capability or capacity to deliver, our staff availability as well as retention issues. And the budgets, like I said, are based on prices identified before the current inflation and supply chain budgets. And then also the increase in cost for acquiring land. has an impact. Yeah, we're working on it. So the flow-on effect of that's year 3. Flow-on effect in our next LTP is that interest rates might increase further. Inflation might take some time to reduce. So the cost in our current LTP are most likely understated. Timing of growth would also have to be reassessed. Higher inflation impacts on revaluation prices on infrastructure assets as well, and that would lead to high depreciation. And then along with the impact of other things like the local government and central government reforms.
So in terms of developing the annual plan post-election, when we reconnect with the new council, we will be revisiting the assumptions, those financial assumptions. So we will be taking expert advice. You're aware that previously we've engaged with Brad Olsen from Infometrics and Earl White. And we are anticipating that they will be engaging with the new council through the induction program as well as these work streams. We will be updating the budgets for the next financial year, identifying any significant cost movements and value propositions, also working within our organisation to identify areas where cost savings can be made and how we best manage risks in this space. We'll also be looking quite intensively at our capital works program and what we can effectively deliver, acknowledging that there have been projects carried forward, as Yolanda mentioned. From that, we'll be highlighting the LTP implications for year 4 and beyond, where those effects become cumulative. And we'll also be undertaking an assessment of our significance and engagement policy. So looking at that as to whether there are issues emerging that require us to actually go out and engage or formally consult with our community through a consultation document. So prior to the end of the calendar year, we'll be connecting with elected members, identifying issues, options, and providing more detail with respect to budgets. We'll be seeking direction on the preferred option for the annual plan before we all break for Christmas. And we'll be seeking agreement on proposed budget changes. So prior to the end of the calendar year, we're anticipating that we'll have an indicative financial position. And this will highlight those long-term plan implications for year 4 and beyond for the long-term plan. So prior to Christmas, we'll be able to confirm our proposed community engagement approach. You're also aware that there are a number of work streams underway where we will be looking to connect with the community early in the calendar year. So how we actually bring those together. So beginning of the new calendar year up to the point of adoption, we'll be refining the financial position and adopting the draft annual plan. If a decision is made and there is reason to produce a consultation document, then we would be putting that to council to adopt and going out to the community. So as I mentioned, that community engagement provides a further opportunity for us to sell our value proposition, something that we've been particularly mindful of as we've had feedback through resident perception surveys. And there are opportunities to align through those various engagement and consultation processes, looking at the likes of Ahu Aki, leading into pre-consultation or pre-engagement on the long-term plan. So where to from here and what is your role? We'll provide greater context and understanding of the current economic environment to help you with your decision making heading into the annual plan and also setting the scene for the next long-term plan. So we'll be connecting with you on that piece of work. We'll provide an update for you following decision making on tranche 1 of the government's Better Off Support Fund. So you're aware that that's coming back to service delivery later this month for a decision to be made. So at this point in time, that hasn't been factored into the work that we've been undertaking on annual plan and initial long-term plan work. Working through those key assumptions, given the uncertainty that the changes that we're experiencing, we will be connecting with those experts to guide us in terms of those assumptions. Also acknowledging that there is a wave of central government reform. So as we get more clarity, that will need to be factored into those assumptions. I think fair to say when we agreed those for the long-term plan, we pretty much said, we weren't expecting, other than those things we knew about RMA reform, Three Waters, that we weren't expecting anything much in addition to that. And we've just seen this constant wave. So I think fair to say, accepting that there is this change is constant. Providing updated information on the financials, and then coming back to elected members for you to identify expectations for the next financial year, and communicating that clearly to our organisation through internal comms. So critical to the success of these work streams, annual plan and long-term plan, will be the development of comprehensive communications and engagement plans. Obviously, with factors indicating potential for increased rates, then as an organisation, we will be needing to do what we can to mitigate the impacts on our communities. And so, one option by way of example could be looking at the utilisation where we have cash surpluses from previous financial years. I'm looking at those tools in our toolkit as to how they can be applied to minimise impacts on our ratepayer communities. So that brings us to a close of the formal presentation, but we're happy to respond to any questions that you may have. And Gary's in attendance to also provide support. Thank you.
I have to say thanks. Pretty grim. Claire and then Roger.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kirsty and Yolanda. It's not really any surprise though, because you've already been signaling to us that these cost pressures are coming. Yeah, and so I'm just going to ask some hard questions about operating costs, because we've had stuff in the media about models of operating. I'm thinking of universities and Te Pūkenga in particular, that, before COVID, it was a good way to do things, but after COVID, sometimes you need to make bigger changes and recognise the reality. Yeah, and so I'd be interested to know what work goes into identifying operating cost savings, or even staffing reductions if positions have changed, and what happens there. I'm also aware that other councils have actually made phenomenal savings through COVID. And I don't know, because I happened to be talking to Auckland councillors or council staff last week, and they said that that they made changes because, or savings, just by having a hard look at things. And what does this council do to find out what other councils are doing to save money? Like, I know that there's a lot of work done on like the digital roadmap and business improvement, but how are you finding out how other people are saving money in other councils? Because I think we're not going to be able to save much on our capital. I mean, I do think you will do a good job of that with the project management, all that. Yeah, so operating's the only other, another obvious one, I guess. Yeah.
I was going to say, Claire, most councils look to us to see how they're saving money, but we're constantly reviewing our systems and processes, particularly, we've set up that group under Georgina Knapp. So we're looking at constantly improving and looking at ways and means of saving money. And you just need to look at the level of rates increase that this council adopted in its last annual plan compared to others to see how hard we've worked to keep costs down. Post-COVID, we are looking at a different way of working. And so we're currently looking at our property strategy, given that we are now able to accommodate a lot more people working from home. So that's one issue we're looking at. Also on the back of that, looking at our fleet, constant review of that. So those are the obvious OPEX costs. But the most difficult OPEX cost is the cost of people. And if there's been an inflationary trend, my sense is that in respect of commodities, that's sitting at about 15%. But what's really been pushing higher than that is the cost of labour, and that's reflected in the contracts we're letting, as well as expectations of people when they apply for roles here. So look, it's constantly under review. As chief executives are regularly meeting and talking and looking at ways in which we can drive efficiencies, especially through things like CoLab.
I do acknowledge the work that has been done there. It's just that, like we hear the statement, staff have worked really hard to reduce operating costs and we'll be able to, keep our rates rises lower. But the reporting that we get about that, like we actually don't know how it's achieved or whether or not it stacks up with, best practice across the sector or how much collaboration is going in to find out how others are saving. And so can we, I guess it's, obviously I accept your word that staff do work really hard on it and that, but the level of reporting on it or that, it doesn't really give us a lot of visibility about it.
So if you cast your mind through, if you cast your mind through the various audits we've undertaken, the internal audits, which look at best practice, and of course there's always this balance between how much effort and resource you put into best practice versus the reward. So we're aiming at a fully competent level, but not super exceeding. So you should take some comfort, particularly in those audits around issues like procurement, insurance, risk management, those sorts of things.
Last question then. And
just in relation to that, procurement is a significant issue, especially when it comes to things like buying electricity and fuel. Those standard very high operating costs. I think our energy cost annually is about $2.5 million now.
Yeah, and because we're trying to participate in broader schemes, like all of government purchasing and that, we're limited as to how active you can be or what strategies. But that's great. But and another part of the equation though is generating our own revenue or like having our own, I suppose, businesses that generate income. And I've raised it in previous years and not really got very far with it, or it's not been taken up. But one proposal that might be a possibility is the EV charging infrastructure, because that's being discussed at a regional council level at the moment, or a regional level. Yeah, and the question was whether or not council should own infrastructure themselves, because generally the investment costs are recouped within 5 years, and then after that, it's profit. But it's not an area that councils have generally been operating in, and there may be other opportunities, energy-wise or fuel-wise, I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, I just thought it's an open discussion, so I just wanted to put those things on the table. Other councils do have businesses or corporations that they operate that generate money to reduce rates overall. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. As a matter of policy, when councils looked at these issues from time to time, it shied away from competing with the private sector. I think if there's an opportunity for us to look more closely, it's probably in our property portfolio. But then, of course, when it comes to maximising the return from that, we tend to invest that back into other capital works programs. Yeah.
Some great observations, Claire. Roger, then Lou.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And actually, Claire did cover some of the questions that I was going to ask. but I think what we can see is that the projected increase in rates that we had in the LTP are going to be consumed by non-productive and non-development aspects, which is a concern because we want to keep the vitality of Waipa going forward. And it looks as if it's going to be quite constricted by the picture that we're seeing here. So yeah, very much of going to be a very interesting discussion as we move forward. Thank you.
And that's a good observation, Roger. I mean, one of our key strategies or ways of mitigating risk, if there was to be a slowdown in the economy, was to attenuate our capital investment and growth. But building consents last year were 9% ahead of the year before, and our growth is already in excess of what we projected. That's a good news story, but what that means is it'd be quite difficult for us to pull back on our capital works program in the growth space. So there are a lot of headwinds here, which mean we're really going to have to be on our A game clear both to save and operating costs. And we do those line by line assessments annually, and we can walk you through this process, you know, as we develop the next annual plan, so that you've got a level of comfort there. But critically, we need to look at our capital works program. One of the really big cost drivers, and it seems to be well ahead of the rate of inflation, is the cost of land. That's a significant issue for us.
No.
Through you, Madam Chair. I agree with Councillor Sinclair and with Councillor Gordon. The issue that I have with this is that our central government is passing a lot of cost through research and legislation that we have to actually align or modify or research, and it ties up a lot of our staff for quite lengthy periods of time. And that has a large cost to the operational costs of our whole infrastructure. And I think there's not a person in this room that would disagree with that. And it really needs, we have to have the staff to give us accurate representations of what these policies impact on us. So I think that we're between a rock and a hard place in that. The other thing I'd like to highlight is that we talked of the risks that are coming up. Those of you that watched Infometrics last issue on population, quite an interesting statistics coming out of that. So we've got to consider that perhaps there isn't a gain in population. We lost 10,000 this year overall in the country, and it looks like it's an ongoing situation. So that could actually impact on the growth perspectives that we've been, using as a strategy. So it's another thing to it. But the final point I'd like to make is that we noticed that over the year 3 of the current LTP, it said debt levels at 308. And I see we're opening 2/3 of that at 195. Is that correct? 1 point, even less. So yeah, right. So I think that's the big positives we can do. And I'm totally in agreement with what our CEO Gary said, in the fact that I think our property portfolio is probably one of the things that is not giving us the greatest return in the current economy. So it's something that maybe we can have a look at and see if we can identify everything.
Thanks, Lou. Andrew.
Yeah, so not arguing with anyone so far, but it does seem like cutting operating costs will the other side of that is levels of service go down, basically. So, that's something that I don't think anyone here wants to see, but it's a reality. Gary, I'm just going to, another area where potentially there could be savings depending on condition assessments is renewals.
That's a good point. I mean, so when you look at the various tools that we can use to bring down costs, one of the things is to look at the extent to which we fund depreciation, given that a lot of these, the revaluation of key infrastructure, it seems to be a blip, and we're talking about a long-term game game here. So we will have to look at the new valuations that come through. And unfortunately, we're going to have to put some assumptions in here because typically the new evaluations don't arrive until about the time when we're adopting the annual plan. But I think we're going to have to make some assumptions around what increase that might be and how we can mitigate that once it lands.
Just on from that, I mean, I'm totally not in favour of deferring maintenance that's required, because it leads to a degradation of assets and greater costs in the future. But on the other hand, underestimating the lifetime of an asset, can cause unnecessary expenditure. So it's just getting it right, I guess, is what we need to look at. I'm certainly not advocating minimising or neglecting maintenance that's needed.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, is Dawn here? Dawn's not. But the work that RATA have done in terms of the optimal replacement time of the roading assets, which is arguably one of our biggest assets, has yielded significant gains so that we're not resealing or rebuilding roads too early or letting them go too long so that they go past the point of no return. So I think RATA have done a fantastic job there in assisting us to get the timing of our interventions on the roads at about the right level.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back to a point around central government reforms and things that we touched on earlier. I wonder if we might somewhere through the process just identify the actual rates increase that those reforms are placing on us. I think it's a really good message to our ratepayers. What percentage, or perhaps there's a number. I was just talking with some of the Hamilton City councillors yesterday. I know they're going to do the same, because it just kind of quantifies what's coming down from central government. They're not our costs on, they are central government costs on us to deliver what our requirements are. So I just wonder if that's kind of something that we can just keep in the back of my mind when we get to that space. It's just a good key message, I think, reminding people that what we do isn't always made up around our table. It's often thrust upon us. So
yeah, no, it's a good way of measuring it, isn't it?
Yeah, following on,
Jim.
It's the comment from government that there's going to be no more taxes from their perspective, and they can do that if they push the costs down onto local government, which is what's happening to a large extent. But how you quantify that is going to be really difficult.
Yeah, actually, well, that's a really good point. I don't want to create another full-time job and trying to quantify it. So if it's too difficult, I appreciate that might be, but I just wondered, just separating that out, and it's just something that might be useful.
Yeah, so I think that identifying operating costs is relatively straightforward. I guess it's the law of unintended consequence. So if you think about, by way of example, the urban intensification legislation. Waipa's towns are relatively young, and so their infrastructure is, by and large, about halfway through its useful life. So they're not yet fully depreciated and not yet fully used. But in order to accommodate the density of growth that's anticipated, we're going to have to upgrade quite a bit of that infrastructure ahead of time. And so that's a significant cost to accommodate, greater urban density. And, at face value, there are far more cost-effective ways of solving that issue than having to rip up pipes, before they're useful. Because, effectively what that legislation says is that without a resource consent, you should be able to apply to build 3 dwellings, 3 stories as of right. So suddenly we've got infrastructure that can't cope with that, particularly stormwater and wastewater, because as your infrastructure ages, you get inflow and infiltration. And so whilst the dry weather flow might say you can accommodate 3 times the growth, certainly when it rains, that's not the case, notwithstanding that we work really hard to reduce inflow and infiltration. So identifying that capital spend on the back of the centrally led policy around intensification is, you know, it's a massive spend, but how I can quantify it, it's very difficult.
Certainly there though, isn't it?
I mean, when you look at that plan change, how it tied up our planning staff for 6 months, it was, and that colossal body of work required just out of the blue, basically. It's,
and then the impact on the work streams that were supposedly, you know, penciled in to be done, and the knock-on effect of all of that, you know.
So notionally, I'm not sure if you've had the report yet, but notionally we think, you know, that's an operating cost imposed. It's about 2% on the rate. It's about $900,000.
Madam Chair, that was the reason I raised the issue, because I can see it sitting, as we do on the Resource Management Act and things, and sitting on these commissions and seeing the preparation, the work that is loaded into us from central government with these pieces of legislation.
Is that's part of your story, and that's how you need to kind of frame things like your annual plan and your long-term plan is, we are doing this because of these reasons. So yeah, it's very much a key part of your storytelling.
The hard part is making that understood though, you know. So just, yeah. Jim.
Just a comment really, and I suppose that has been touched on already, reducing costs. You've got to reduce the standards and the level of service. So that's always the downside. And I think Lou touched on it. I think in terms of our national population growth, and we still have a higher than expected growth because of the level of service we provide. So effectively, we're restacking the deck chairs as a country, and they're coming to Waipa because it's a good place to live. It's got employment opportunities, obviously good transportation networks, etc. So long term, I think if central government doesn't come up with an immigration policy that indicates that they're going to open the borders and allow a lot of extra people into the country, we're looking at nil population growth or potentially decreasing. And how long we can keep attracting people into Waipa over and above other areas of the country, we've got to start really thinking about. And a lot of our I suppose plans for the future have been based on an increasing population, an economic growth driven by population increase, and how are we going to deliver the level of service to our community, in fact, with potentially a decreasing population. And those are the issues that we're going to have to struggle with for that sort of long-term planning. But it's really coming to a head for the next annual plan round, just what the implications are. And be really, I don't know whether anyone's done any work on if we were to deliver the next year's annual plan with this inflation and issues, and what rates would we be looking at going out with to be able to sort of get in our mind what we've got to do to pull it back to what's an acceptable level. And I would imagine the rate implication with the inflation and costs and staffing would just blow that way out of the water. Do we know what it would look like? Yeah, no, not even wet finger in the wind. No, not game to say. But look, it's going to be a really challenging environment for the next 3 years, absolutely, I would suggest.
Hey, Susan, probably back me up on this. We're finding some amazing cost increases in our own farming business, just stuff we never envisaged, you know, fertilizer, for example, going up 150%. That's a huge cost. It beats wages hands down, but you would just everybody be facing that, you know, $375 an hour for a vet. a lot of vets coming onto my farm.
Travel charges. They stuck in my throat.
The other impact that they might well see is the redistribution of the rateable value across the district, as we know that the urban property prices in both of the main areas have risen quite substantially over the last 2 to 3 years, and that redistribution of that rateable value may create some additional applied rates increases in some of those residential areas.
So it won't affect the total rate required, but it will certainly affect the distribution of their rate. Yeah.
Well, I think everybody's had their bit to say about that. Obviously, some pretty grim, but not altogether unpredictable results or introductory comments there, and a bit of sharpening of pencils and a whole lot of interesting work to be done, I guess, going forward in this space. So, Gary, did you want to?
Well, look, staff will work as hard as we can to work with you to identify what an acceptable level of rates increase might be, and we did that last time, and you said to us, you've got to land on the year 2 of the LTP, which is what we did. So there's an issue between being as efficient as you can with your operating costs, and I'm pretty happy we're playing in a very efficient space. But then you raise the question around if we're going to reduce operating costs, what level of service will we have to do away with? And we've got a number of tools that we can use to land on a number, but critically, we've got to understand what that number is so that we can gear the organisation to achieve that.
What's the line, Gary, that you get to where it starts becoming an organisation that people don't want to work here? Like, I think that's, we can screw down as much as we can, but then isn't it a fine balancing act to make people want to actually still be involved with why paramedics is a great place to work?
Yeah, so this year we've funded market movements and salaries, which is good. And annually we do a staff engagement survey, and we're sitting above our peers at around about best practice. When those numbers start to decline, then you've got to have a serious look.
Trade-offs, right? Yeah. Okay. I think we've done that one to death for today, and no doubt we'll be back.